Idaho City and the Pioneer Cemetery, Memories Through Time by Gabrielle Moore. Memorial Day in the United States is often celebrated by gathering a family and honoring those who have passed away by visiting their graves. This tradition was customary in my family as I was growing up here in Boise, Idaho. A few of my relatives are buried in a traditional cemetery at the corner of Cloverdale and Fairview that has roads and easy-to-find grave markers. But most of my family lies at eternal rest some 40 miles up Highway 21, just outside of Idaho City, at a place called the Pioneer Cemetery, also known as Boot Hill. It is the cemetery and the town of Idaho City where my awareness of sites of remembrance first took shape and the traditions of honoring those who have passed are rooted. The Pioneer Cemetery and Idaho City have always been a part of my life. However, their significance has changed drastically for me through time, leaving a patchwork of memories. As a child, Memorial Day weekend was very predictable. My mother would buy me a new dress and wait for my Uncle Frank to arrive. We would find whatever spring flowers were in bloom in our yard, usually irises and peonies, and put them in foil-wrapped Folgers cans we had been saving. The fragrance of coffee grounds and freshly cut flowers still makes me smile. We would gather our vases, some picnic items, and then head out on our journey north to Idaho City. It was all of these things, the places, the smells, the rituals, and activities that marked the Memorial Day holiday for me. Something Barbara Mistel spoke to in her writings about memory experience. Memory cannot be removed from its social context, since whenever we remember something, we also recall the social circumstances in which the event took place, the city, the university, friends, and so on. These things cannot be separated. They are collectively a memory. For my family, the legacy of this area goes back nearly 100 years. My mother, along with her 5 siblings, all grew up in Idaho City during the 1920s and 30s, while my grandfather Edgar tried to make his fortune in gold mining. Life during the Depression in this boomtown was not easy. The winters were long and living conditions were abysmal. But there was always the promise of a better life with the next dredge, a promise that never came to fruition for my family. 4 generations of my family have lived there in the house that remained in our family until 2011. It is the hub of traditions and memories for all of us. The Pioneer Cemetery is located northwest of town, down a series of dirt roads. It is a place that is well traveled now, but back in the late 1970s, the road was less maintained and felt much more isolated. There were so many other places I would rather be, but as with many family rituals, it was my obligation to visit the graves of people whose stories my mother and her brother delighted in retelling year after year. A practice that was meaningless to me at the time, but they seemed to find great comfort in the process. Over the years, stories were repeated, each time taking on a different nuance or emphasis, but I listened patiently. Because the past is frequently used as a mirror in which we search for an explanation and remedy to our present-day problems, memory is seen as a cure to the pathologies of modern life. John Winter also spoke about such time-honored family rituals and said, "This transmission of childhood memories over 2 or sometimes 3 generations gives family stories a power that is translated at times into activity, the activity of remembrance." Unlike most cemeteries, there is no grass, no groundspeople keeping up the neatly trimmed hedges or perfectly organized rows of matching headstones. The land for the Pioneer Cemetery was set aside in 1864 and has never changed. It is estimated that over 3,000 graves are scattered throughout the 40 acres of timbered land, but less than 300 graves are identified. While there are some groupings and pathways, the majority of the space seems random. If I close my eyes, I can transport myself there now. The smell of pine trees, the crunch of pine needles underfoot, and the songs of the cicadas engulfing the area like a soundtrack. There are narrow dirt paths that wind you around and up the hill. The further in you walk, the older the graves become. Some graves are fenced with rudimentary wooden slats. Others have ornate iron fences. And then some have only a hand-carved marker. As a child, only the ostentatious headstones drew my attention. But as I grew older, it was the stories they told that I loved. Because shifts in time and perspective alter our view of these grave forms, their verbal, visual, architectural, and material messages may not be readily evident. The gravestones themselves tell a story about the unique time and manner in which they lived. Laura Schwann remarks about this on the nature of grave markers and states, As a tool for historical inquiry, gravestones are more than just memorials to the deceased. Instead, they are a form of expression. As a child, this place was more like a field trip during which my mother and her brother tried to relay stories of the people buried there. But I was more focused on what I could see: the trees, the fences, and the mysterious pathways that seemed to reach back into the forest without end. As I got older, my mother would send me off in the summer to stay with her brother, Frank, who lived in Idaho City. Frank was an enigma. He had lived his entire adult life in Idaho City, in the home he and his siblings were raised in. A mechanical engineer by trade, he could fix or build anything. But he never had the desire to work a regular job. He refused to comply with society's rules. His hair was long, which he kept in a ponytail, and his manners were rough, and hygiene was not his top priority. But never a kinder soul would you meet. Everything at his place, including his clothes, furniture, and vehicles, smelled of Irish Spring soap and chainsaw oil. When he wasn't logging, he spent his time up in the mountains on one of a dozen of mining claims, chasing the same dream of finding the same gold his father had. Never having married, he was known as the hermit who lived up on the hill. While staying with Frank, I met new friends and found that small-town living allowed freedoms that I had never had in Boise. Many summer days we would go swimming at Warm Springs Pool, then wander around town until we got bored. However, my favorite times were spent walking to the Pioneer Cemetery. We were never disrespectful. We would merely hang out in the parking lot telling ghost stories. Upon a whim, my friends and I agreed to meet up there for witching hour one night. As we stood around telling stories and imagining all the spirits looming around the graves, we noticed a small light off in the distance. Knowing that only thing beyond the cemetery was forest made us motionless with fear as we waited, with the light coming closer and closer. Instantly, we began running for our lives. Of course, we later discovered it was another friend who had hiked through the forest to find us. I will never forget the mystery and exhilaration that night brought. In my teen years, the Pioneer Cemetery transformed again. It was now a place of ghosts, the things that cannot be seen, where my imagination created horror movie scenes and where friends dared you to go. Years later, my visits to the Idaho City area and Pioneer Cemetery have continued, but now I bring along my own family. I find myself revisiting the stories and places of my childhood and trying to pass down a sense of legacy to my children. As an adult, the cemetery became something new entirely. It morphed into a place of reverence where I became aware of relationships and the connectedness here. Focusing now on what lied below the ground, the space became more meaningful. Some of the graves are so old that visitors no longer come to pay their respects. Many conversations were had with my children about why some graves are bigger than others, or why some have stuffed animals on them when others seem abandoned. What makes the cemetery a particularly good text to begin with is that it not only shows us what and how we remember, but it is also a place to look to see what is forgotten. With age, most people become keenly aware of the dates on gravestones. So many young people lost to illnesses, many of which are merely inconveniences in our modern world. Many of these people were literally pioneers, people who had come here hoping for a better life and chasing stories of gold nuggets, but found only heartache and death. While it is difficult to see what is not there, what is not written, cemeteries can do just that if we learn to read the cemetery, not looking at merely words written on stones, but rather reading the stones that are illegible, looking at the boundaries and seeing how they've changed, seeing what is restored and what is not, recognizing who is not there. In the early months of 2009, Frank was diagnosed with brain cancer. Although the surgeon was able to remove most of the tumor, Frank's 80-year-old body never found the strength to recover. In March of 2009, he passed away. His enigmatic life somehow just stopped. We buried him alongside his friends, neighbors, and relatives amongst the pine trees in that old cemetery. Now when I go to visit Idaho City and the Pioneer Cemetery, I look around and I see gravestones of people I know. My aunts Iola and Faniel, my friend Diane, and my hermit Uncle Frank, who taught me so much. The cemetery has once again taken on a whole new meaning for me because I am now focused on the memories. A central function of gravestones and cemeteries is to serve as material embodiments of memory. But while memorials appear to be permanent, memories are constantly changing. Much like a patchwork quilt, as time marches on from childhood through our teen years and on through adulthood, we pick up little pieces along the way, and we sew these pieces together with ribbons of tradition and memories until we have a completed life tapestry, beautifully woven together and purposefully designed. Thank you.